The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly, episode 27, where we've been talking about, get your glasses ready, PCI. So glad it's Cinco de Mayo. Before we jump back into the discussion that is loosely focused on the news, we do have a couple more announcements. First off, we're looking for some high-quality guest suggestions, really for all of our shows on the podcast, to fill up our third quarter recording schedule. If you have somebody in mind that you think would be great as somebody we should interview on any of our shows, submit your suggestions by visiting securityweekly.com/guest. There's a form that you fill out. You can pick which show, or you can leave it blank, and we can decide. All of the hosts and staff review these suggestions regularly, and we'll get back to you if we decide to move forward with any of your suggestions. Also, if you want to learn how penetration testing reduces risk, our next live webcast is with Core Security, which is a help systems company. They're going to be talking all about that. You can register for it or any of our upcoming webcasts or virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/webcast. You can also access our on-demand library of previously recorded webcasts and trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/on-demand. This has been a fun show because we've been talking PCI.
And tequila tongue ties you, Mr. Host.
And tequila does make its impact. This is our traditional Second Spot news segment. I put up some news articles. I think Josh did too. Although Josh, I looked at yours and saw that you're going back 10 years. So I'm not sure.
No. I only went back 10 years on one article. All right.
Well,
cut the crap.
One article goes back 10 years.
The other articles are within the last 6 months or so.
But
stop.
if there was a theme, it's you're trying to get under my skin about PCI and how the world views PCI and how it's silly and whatnot.
I would never do those things.
Yes,
I don't know why you're saying those things about me.
But I'll let you take the lead. Is there any of these articles you want to start with? We can go through one or more or all, but I'll let you pick. Order.
That's a good question. Let's start with where'd I go? There we go. So I think the whole theme was actually I was looking for deficiencies in PCI. You're absolutely correct.
Sure.
Okay. I wasn't deliberately trying to get under your skin, or was I? But I thought that it was interesting that PCI is a very definitive and authoritative resource in a lot of realms and a lot of ways, but there's still problems. And anybody that thinks that it's the only answer is just simply wrong. Not that you would ever say that, Jeff, of course. But there's some things that I don't like about PCI still, and I've got to ask you a question. You're the expert. I totally agree with that. The one article that I went back 10 years, the one article out of five that I went back 10 years was about retroactive revocation of PCI compliance. Right. This is something that we've talked about for a long time. The fact that the PCI Council at one point would retroactively retract you are PCI compliant, the certification, if you will, once you've been breached. Does that still happen?
Right. Well, so what happened historically was, and this sort of happened in waves. Mid to late 2000s, there was the Albert Gonzalez hacking ring that hit a lot of retailers and actually service providers. I know about them because I was working for a lot of those companies before, during, and after their breaches. it was certainly sort of the mantra back then that no company that was breached was PCI compliant at the time of the breach, and therefore, especially in the case of a service provider, the compliance attestation was revoked. It was somewhat semantic. I think it was somewhat political. It was somewhat, trying to,
I think the word you're looking for is crap.
Put lipstick on the pig, whatever key phrase you want to use. Does it still happen today? I mean, the next big wave of breaches, not that they're not happening still, was the last couple years with Target and Home Depot and a few others. And still the mantra was, nobody's compliant at the time of the breach. I don't know that the revocation of compliance technically doesn't happen from the security standards company, because they will tell you that they don't enforce the standard. They're simply the authors. They're pulling from the different card brands and industry organizations that are tied into all the PCI ecosystem, what I like to call it. The revocation comes from, if you're a service provider, it comes from the card brands. I mean, Visa maintains a list of companies that provide service provider functions for mostly the merchant or retail community. And you will certainly be dropped from that list if you suffer a breach, and you have to earn your way back by going through the compliance assessment again. If you're a merchant, technically merchants are the responsibility of their acquiring bank or the commercial bank. Right. The commercial banks are the ones that are technically fined if there's a breach of one of their merchant customers. So it's between the bank and the merchant whether the compliance is accepted or rejected or revoked or not. And that tends to not be publicized as much as sort of kept in house. So it's harder to answer that question definitively. I think generally the impression is still, if you're breached, you weren't compliant at the time of the breach, because that preserves the perceived integrity of the PCI data security standard. What I would say is it's kind of silly that it's come to that, because the PCI data security standard, if you read through the whole thing, doesn't and never was intended to guarantee that you wouldn't suffer a breach. It was designed to, let's eliminate all the stuff that we know about, all the historical breaches or historical attacks and threat vectors, sort of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. Let's eliminate all that, but then also let's prepare yourself for when a breach does happen. I mean, one of the major sections and one of the major headaches for a lot of companies that have to follow PCI requirement 10 has to do with collecting logs, the right kind of logs on a continuous basis, transferring them to a centralized log server and reviewing them on a daily basis. All and basically collecting the forensics trail so that when you're breached, you can figure out the source, figure out the cause, hopefully plug the holes and move on. So to me, it's always been interesting that the perception that PCI prevents a breach, when a good portion of PCI is helping you to prepare for the breach and to do it in a responsible and timely manner. So that's sort of one good example of how PCI, in my mind, is very often misunderstood and misapplied.
That's 3 drinks if you're keeping tally at home, by the way.
Yes, it was. We're up to
now 19. I'll shut up and you talk and I'll drink.
We're up to 19 mentions, just FYI, of PCI by Jeff Mann. If you haven't taken 19 shots or sips at this point, you're not keeping up. Okay? Remember, we do not take responsibility for any of the bad decisions you make. Anyway, I think the problem was not so much about the policies and procedures, the way that it was done, Jeff, but the retroactive revocation. But I think one of the points you raised was fascinating, and I think I have an article in there about that. I believe it's the first one, where it says that PCI isn't as important, where it says that just a third of global firms are, this is interesting too, but only a third of global firms were actually found to be PCI compliant or care about PCI compliance. So there are obviously banks and payment mechanisms, shall we say, that are not keeping track of who's PCI compliant in their infrastructure, in their ecosystem, I should say. And that's fascinating in and of itself. But there was one, I think that's the one I screwed up and didn't get the right one in there. There was a Verizon report, I believe, I'll double check, that said that a year after being certified, getting their ROC, their AOC, the whole 9 yards, the PCI compliance, a stamp, if you will, they were found that most of the security controls were neglected, not being done, not properly performed, just that they had effectively failed to be PCI compliant, even though they were still certified, because, and you mentioned this yourself, they just weren't paying attention.
Right.
And that's a problem, I think. And I think that that's why PCI and most, if not all, compliance standards and frameworks need to go to continuous rather than point in time. And I don't know if anybody disagrees at this point. Does anybody disagree?
Well, Matt, you were trying to say something.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with, I think, most of these compliance regimes is you take a snapshot, a point in time review. The report on compliance is that snapshot for the PCI DSS. As soon as that that point in time is assessed and said, yep, you're all good, literally the next day it could change and you could be out of compliance. So to your point, Josh, I think continuous is ultimately where a lot of these regimes need to move to, so that you can prove a level of compliance on a continuous basis, not once a year, once every 2 years, 3 years, whatever that window is for that point in time snapshot. I think that's one of the challenges. And that's why a lot of people look at, I think, PCI not as a security standard, because the report on the compliance is that single snap in time that people are like, yeah, okay, I'm just going to go get this done. I'm going to go get my stamp, and then I'm going to go do whatever else I want. And now I know, Jeff, that's not what it was intended to do, but that, I think, is the way it is handled by a number of organizations, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you meant. Let me address your question. I'm just piggybacking on what Matt said. Because I wanted to disagree with you, Josh, ultimately, but Matt sort of highlighted, what was the intent of the PCI standard and the way it's used and implemented, if you will, there's a disconnect there. Yes, it's an annual validation that you're following a set of rules, but the rules themselves very often have continuous built into them. Like I just mentioned, requirement 10, you're supposed to be reviewing your event logs, any log that has. You're supposed to log any access to cardholder data or systems that transmit, process, store cardholder data, a specific type of data that's sensitive to your operations. You're supposed to review logs on a daily basis. That sort of implies to me that that's something that's done continuously. There's other requirements that you're supposed to do things on a weekly basis, a daily basis. The scanning requirements at a minimum is, scan as often as you want, but once a quarter, once every 90 days, show that you've got clean passing results for your vulnerability scans. So it goes to the way it's been interpreted and implemented, as Matt says. But to me, it's always been kind of weird because there's so much continuous built into the standard itself. The Security Council, when they rolled out, I believe it was with version 3, which came out in 2013, is where they put explicit language in acknowledging the fact that most people treat it as a point-in-time assessment. They tried to build in language to underscore and reinforce the fact that, no, this is stuff that you're supposed to be doing on an ongoing basis. But my most recent PCI customer very much had the approach of, we just got to get to the finish line. Whatever our compliance date is, we got to make sure we got these technical controls in place, past whatever it is, by the time we get to the finish line. And they were, in my opinion, kind of totally ignoring all the process and procedure that needed to go into something that was supposed to be happening on an ongoing basis. Case in point, they put together a Tiger team and gave the Tiger team 6 months to help the particular business unit get a passing vulnerability scan, which is a 90-day, 3-month requirement. And I asked them, I said, why are you giving yourself 6 months to do something that you're supposed to do once a quarter? Never really got a good answer, and I don't work for them anymore, strangely enough. Next question.
Well, I don't want to go question. I want to go into some of this news, right? So,
okay, sure.
One of the articles you put in here was PCI compliance is vital to the economic engine of the world. And I read this article and I'm like, really? I'm like, everything you talk about in this article, we've already known, or this has been in place for a while. And then I scroll all the way to the bottom, and it's a pitch for a vendor, and I'm like, oh no. So I had to ignore this one because it just it's silliness.
And I apologize. I didn't get to the bottom of the article. I just saw the compelling headline.
Yeah, but when you read the article, you're like, ugh, really? Okay, a little outdated, and then it's a vendor pitch at the bottom. Okay, what I thought was a little more interesting is, despite spending more on compliance, business still have basic IT weaknesses. I mean, we talk about this all the time, right? They do not equate to be the same. So this wasn't surprising. So I was just trying to dig into some of this news, and is there anything really interesting in here? Is there anything new? I'm not seeing it, Jeff, right? I'm trying to figure out, is there anything new in here? Anybody?
Well, the irony is, and I guess it always depends on perspective. My view of PCI is it represents a pretty decent standard by which you measure a security program, and the fundamentals and the basics of how you build a security program don't really change over time. Obviously, technology changes, and how you have to apply the rules and how you meet the rules and the requirements change based on the technology that you're deploying. But the principles, the guidelines, the goals don't really change. So in that sense, I mean, information security in general, there's nothing new. I mean, we're trying to protect sensitive data. We're trying to stay in business. We're trying to protect national security interests. None of that really changes. What does change is the technology, which begs sort of a follow-on question to your observation, Matt. And I'm not disagreeing. There isn't anything new, but I wonder if, because there's nothing new and there's no perception of nothing new, of something new, is that one reason why vendors, their sales and marketing programs don't latch on to something like PCI, because of the perception, right or wrong, that the marketing pitches have to be new. They always have to emphasize the new and highlight the new and the different. I mean, I had this thought the other day. How many of our conventional products that we buy in grocery stores in boxes and bottles every 6 months or a year have the label new and improved on the packaging? And have they really changed anything? Or have they changed the label?
I remember reading a story
They've
about
changed the amount
cough
that they're putting in
that
the
changed
bottle.
their name from like version 4 to version 4000, and that was the new and improvement. They changed the name.
Right.
And
what was it? There was a company that had that did tea, right? TEA. They had a tea. It was a tea company, and they put blockchain in their name, and their stock shot up like 4,000%.
Iced tea company, yeah.
Was it Long Island? Was it Long Island iced tea?
Silliness.
Right, but that's what I'm trying to say.
Long Island iced teas don't have tea in it.
Not a bit.
It's got a splash.
You're correct, sir.
And a whole lot of liquor.
And you're technically correct. The best kind of correct.
So, John, let me answer the question.
In all seriousness, though,
I do want to answer.
Matt wants to answer the question.
Here we go.
Josh, have a PCI. Josh, take a drink. Go ahead, Matt.
So you asked the question, our vendor, is the reason why vendors don't talk about PCI because they're always chasing the new improved thing. And I think there is definitely some viability to that. Everybody's chasing the next shiny object, right? Everybody wants to be in the security operations center, or they want to be on the forefront of automation and orchestration, or they want to do all this new stuff, right? Because they think this is where the next set of revenue comes in. But if we go back and we look at things like the Equifax breach in the discussion we had yesterday with Graham Payne, it boils down to basics: vulnerability scanning, patching, configuration management, basic policies. And I think one of the fears I have in our industry is that so many vendors are chasing the new shiny stuff that we're forgetting about the basics. And it's the basics that are causing us grief in these new technologies. So let's think about cloud for a second. Right. Certain aspects of cloud, do I really need to control certain aspects of security? No, because maybe the cloud provider does it. But here's what matters. Configuration matters. Because if you misconfigure an S3 bucket, guess what? You've just exposed all your data to the internet, and that's why we see breaches. So sometimes we're moving so far to the brand new shiny stuff that we're also forgetting about some of the basic stuff. And that scares me a little bit in our industry.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because, and as a sidebar, I think my Article 5 actually talks about the responsibility for cloud security. But it's interesting that you bring up, and I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm interested now in listening to the interview that you did yesterday. You're emphasizing that time and time again, what causes the breaches at these companies, especially the big companies that we expect to be resilient and not fall to such major breaches, it is determined to be because of some of the basics. Ironically, or maybe deliberately, the areas that PCI, the data security standard, are more prescriptive on are very often these very basic things that you just described are very often the things that are missed and why breaches happen. To which I simply say, PCI, people have this attitude about it, but if you followed it, a lot of those basic things that are time and time again the reasons or the causes for so many major breaches gets addressed, goes away. Maybe we should revisit, maybe the collective we should look twice or again, or frankly, maybe for the first time, at just what PCI says and what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has, look, there is nothing sexy about configuration management, nothing at all.
Nope.
Nope. People would much rather do threat hunting, pen testing, do some orchestration automation in their SOC. But if we look at these breaches, a lot of it boils down to basic configuration or vulnerability or patch management. Unfortunately, that's what these things deal with. In a lot of respects, those are just the basics. They're not sexy. I get it. Everybody's chasing the shiny object, but that's what's getting us breached. And so to your point, Jeff, I think, looking at something like a PCI data security standard is covering the basics. It is a very good guide to cover the basics. And people who aren't doing the basics, I think, are just fooling themselves that they're going to be secure and prevent breaches.
So if we have a company that we think is mature in their security and compliance regime, right, but they're not doing the basics, are they really mature?
I would say no.
I would say no too.
But to rephrase your question though, and I think this touches on a perception that's common in the industry, if not the world, is if a company has implemented one too many PCI drinks, sorry.
Implemented
the coolest and shiniest and niftiest and costliest security tools and solutions and monitoring solutions, and they've got all this stuff because they've got the money and the budget, and they believe that if they've got all that, maybe this is the question, is it appropriate to think that if you got all the shiny and you got the budget for all the cool stuff, you don't have to do the basics, that somehow you've circumvented or moved beyond the basics? Is there a lesson here that no, there's no getting away from doing the basics?
I still don't.
Yes, the lesson is simple. Smack the people that think that.
Look, I'll give you example after example. The Capital One breach.
Yep.
Capital One spent. Look, I love what they've been doing. Right, they've been moving their stuff to the cloud. They've invested a lot of money in security. They were still breached, and it was a basic misconfiguration type of issue that propagated that breach to happen. Equifax was spending money. They may not have been prioritizing the right money in the right places, still breached, right? So this stuff still happens. And so I don't think you can get away from some of these basics.
Sorry, Matt, I had to speak over top of you there. Not just breached, but also found guilty for insider trading. Let's not forget that as well.
True.
So
that was something different, but anyways, yes.
Well, different, but somewhat related. Bad behaviors, bad things. So, if we were going to attempt to wrap this up, and obviously PCI is going to continue to come up in our discussions as we move forward as a show, is it fair to say that PCI deserves another look, or perhaps a renewed focus? Maybe people should go back to it as an example of basic security 101, something you should do, something you should address, regardless of whether you're technically, subject to PCI. Agree, disagree?
I think there is a lot of good in the PCI data security standard that gets a bad rap because it falls under the umbrella of PCI. And so to answer your question, I think if you rebranded exactly what's in PCI with a little broader focus than just cardholder data, it might get some renewed interest in actually helping organizations with a roadmap of how to build some of the basic security principles in your organization.
Fair. Scott?
I like that.
Is Scott frozen? I think he's frozen.
Oh, thank God it's not just me.
I think the Wookiee took him out.
Wait, am I frozen too?
I think Jeff's frozen too. I think Maryland's like that.
Oh, come on.
I'm back. What? Okay, we're all back. What? Quick, Josh, repeat what you were saying.
Son of a breach. What happened?
Scott, say something. I don't know. We all just blanked out.
How about this? PCI is a great base framework. There are some improvements that need to be made. My biggest one, I think, would be the continuous versus point in time. I think that's going to be a very, very difficult step.
Well, I agree, because it's perception as much as what's built into the requirement, built into the standard. It's how the standard's implemented, and I agree. It's one of my pet peeves with how PCI is used and abused. The perception that it's a point in time assessment. How do we overcome that? How do we get beyond that?
Well, we have to make pen testing more automated, and I know that's anathema to many people, but I'm sorry, it's the truth. Pen testing is commoditizing. Pen testing is specializing. The next step is we need to automate the basic pieces of pen tests to make them so that we can run them continuously. We need to automate a significant amount of compliance. We need to automate a significant amount of evidentiary repository checking. We need to automate a lot of these pieces to make it just as simple as antivirus, to make it as simple as vulnerability scanning, which we can do every 10 minutes if we felt like it. Nobody would care. And those pieces need to be automated so they can be run all the time. Because remember, it's not necessarily the answers you find, but the changes you discover along the way. That's what you need to concentrate on. Just as configuration management, as Matt so aptly said, is not sexy. Nobody wants to do configuration management. It's incredibly important, because if I can find that there's an entire group of my company that hasn't been following config management, you know what? They've opened up a massive attack surface into my company. And I don't think anybody would argue with that. So if I'm not monitoring for that, I'm not going to see it. We have to make all the pieces that we do as automated as possible to make them as monitorable, is that a word, as possible. Make sense?
Yeah. My only question is, how many PCI sayings are we at, Josh? What's our final count?
From just Jeff, we're at 28.
Oof.
So,
drink.
I'm buzzed. Thank you, Jeff. I'm very relaxed.
No, it doesn't matter. Let me throw my 2 cents in here. It doesn't really matter what compliance regime you're going after. If you're not doing the basics, you're really screwing it up, right? And the basics are vulnerability scanning, configuration management, change control, making sure that you have hardened images that you're using, and that you have a security awareness program put into your organization somewhere. So at the end of the day, you're not saying son of a breach.
Might disagree on the particulars, but in general, yes, Scott, PCI is the basics. You addressed most of them. The order might change, the preference might change, precedence might change, but I think in the interests of everybody's liver and having a productive rest of the day, we probably should call it for this episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed the discussion. We didn't set out to change your minds, but hopefully maybe think more or think twice or think again about PCI, because it is different. It is not just compliance. It's set apart from other things that we've talked about, and there's a good reason for that. There's a reason for that. Maybe it's not a good reason. I'm not going to assign a value to it. But until next time, and next time we are going to be talking to Malware Jake on a very interesting topic, so tune in for that next week. Stay safe, stay isolated. If you're going to venture out, do it safely and at a safe distance, and wear your masks. And until next time, this is all of us for Security and Compliance Weekly. We are sloshed, and we're out.